There are moments when the day finally goes quiet and you're left alone with yourself, not in a dramatic way, just stillness. It often happens late at night, when there's nothing left to distract you, no one asking anything of you, no role to play. And that's when you notice it. A kind of heaviness. Not the kind that comes from crying, not the kind that looks like sadness, just a weight you carry quietly without knowing when it arrived. You wake up with it, you move through your day with it, and even when things are technically fine, it's still there, sitting somewhere behind your chest or in the way your body feels slower than it used to. It doesn't announce itself, it doesn't demand attention, it just makes everything feel a little harder than it should. Getting out of bed, answering messages, holding conversations that used to feel effortless. And the strangest part is this: nothing is wrong enough to explain it. Your life hasn't collapsed, you haven't failed in some obvious way. There isn't a single moment you can point to and say, that's when it started. Yet something feels heavier than before. So you try to make sense of it quietly. You wonder if you're just tired or unmotivated or becoming someone weaker than you were. But none of those explanations fully fit. Because the heaviness doesn't feel like giving up. It doesn't feel like laziness. And it doesn't feel like sadness either. It feels more like carrying something invisible, something you can't put down because you're not even sure what it is. And maybe what unsettles you most is how alone it feels. Not because no one is around, but because it feels hard to explain. So you keep going, you function, you do what's expected, all while quietly wondering why everything feels heavier than it used to, even when nothing obvious has changed. And if you've had moments like this, especially in silence, especially at night, then this feeling isn't random, and it isn't just you. When this heaviness lingers, the mind rarely stays neutral about it for long. Almost instinctively, it turns inward. You begin to question yourself. You wonder if you're just not strong enough anymore, if you've become ungrateful, if something in you is failing to keep up with life the way it's supposed to. And without realizing it, the weight you were already carrying quietly turns into something heavier. Judgment. There's a familiar voice that appears at moments like this. It doesn't shout. It doesn't accuse loudly. It simply compares. It reminds you that others are managing more, that people with harder lives still wake up and keep going, that you don't have a good enough reason to feel this way. So you minimize what you're feeling. You tell yourself it doesn't count, that it shouldn't matter. And slowly, the heaviness stops being something you experience and starts feeling like something you're doing wrong. This is where many people begin to turn against themselves. They label the feeling as weakness, as laziness, as a personal flaw that needs to be corrected. But notice something important here. The heaviness didn't begin as self-criticism. It became heavier only after judgment entered the picture. Before that, it was just a sensation, a quiet weight, an internal signal. It wasn't accusing you of anything. Yet somewhere along the way, you were taught that struggling without visible damage means you're exaggerating. That if you're still functioning, you shouldn't question how much effort that functioning takes. That feeling weighed down, without a clear explanation, is somehow a moral failure. So instead of listening to the experience, you try to silence it. Instead of allowing it to exist, you argue with it. And that internal resistance, the constant questioning of whether you're allowed to feel this way, becomes its own burden. If you've been doing this, often quietly and without realizing it, there's something important to pause on. This heaviness is not evidence of weakness. It is not proof that you're ungrateful. And it is not a verdict on who you are as a person. It's something you're experiencing, not something you are. And the moment you stop treating it like a personal failure, something subtle but significant begins to lift. Not the heaviness itself, but the weight of blaming yourself for carrying it. There is a kind of weight that doesn't come from emotion and doesn't announce itself as distress. It comes from something quieter, from the mind having nowhere to rest. Most days, your attention is being pulled in dozens of directions at once. Information arrives constantly, messages, updates, expectations, noise. And even when you step away from it, your mind often doesn't. It stays alert, scanning, tracking what still needs to be done, remembered, responded to. Not because something is wrong, but because it has learned to stay ready. Over time, this creates a subtle accumulation, thoughts that don't finish, questions that never fully settle, mental tabs left open, one after another, until the mind feels crowded rather than busy. This isn't the sharp pressure people usually associate with stress, and it isn't the restless urgency of anxiety. It's heavier than that. It's the quiet effort of holding too much at once for too long without ever fully setting it down. Even moments that look like rest on the outside often aren't. The body may pause, but the mind keeps working, replaying conversations, anticipating what's next, staying available to everything that might be required. There is no clear boundary where mental effort ends, so the weight builds gradually, not in a way that feels alarming, just in a way that makes everything take more energy than it used to. Simple decisions feel dense, silence feels oddly full, even doing nothing can feel like it takes effort. This isn't because the mind is failing, it's because it's been asked to carry a volume of input that never fully resolves. There is very little space to process, to integrate, to release. Instead, the mind adapts by holding, storing fragments of attention, responsibility, and unfinished thought. And when something is held continuously, without a natural place to put it down, it begins to feel heavy. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily. So the heaviness you notice isn't a collapse, it's accumulation. A mind doing exactly what it knows how to do, staying engaged, staying ready, staying on, even when there's no clear moment of relief. And over time, that constant engagement starts to weigh on you, quietly shaping how everything feels. Not because you can't handle life, but because your mind has been carrying more than it was ever meant to hold at once. Beyond the mind's constant engagement, there is another kind of weight that settles in more quietly, not in thoughts, but in restraint. Much of daily life asks you to stay composed, to respond in measured ways, to manage how you come across, even when something inside you wants to move differently. You hold reactions back, you soften what you feel before it reaches the surface, you translate your inner world into something more acceptable, more manageable, more contained. And most of the time, this happens automatically. You stay steady when things feel uneven. You remain present even when you're depleted. You listen, you respond, you show up, often without drawing attention to how much effort that takes. This kind of effort rarely looks dramatic from the outside. There's no visible release, no obvious overflow, but it requires energy. Emotional availability is not just about feeling. It's about regulating what gets expressed and what stays inside. And when that regulation continues without pause, it creates a form of fatigue that isn't immediately recognizable. The exhaustion doesn't come from having emotions. It comes from consistently containing them, from being aware of how you affect others, from staying balanced, even when something inside you isn't, from absorbing moments without fully processing them because there isn't space to do so. Over time, that restraint accumulates. Not as tension, not as overwhelm, but as a steady pressure, the feeling of always holding yourself together. Even moments that should feel light can begin to feel effortful. Conversations require presence, connection requires energy. And yet, because you're still functioning, still participating, it's easy to overlook how much emotional work is happening beneath the surface. Nothing appears wrong, you aren't falling apart, you're simply carrying the quiet cost of internal regulation without recovery. When feelings are continuously moderated rather than released, they don't disappear. They remain held, and what stays held, especially over long periods of time, doesn't announce itself loudly. It settles, it deepens. And eventually, it contributes to that familiar sense of heaviness, not as an emotional reaction, but as the weight of sustained inner restraint. Not because you feel too much, but because you've been holding so much for so long without a place to set it down. There is a particular kind of heaviness that appears even when life seems to be moving forward, not stuck, not falling apart, just continuing. You keep doing what needs to be done, you meet expectations, you stay responsible, you handle what's in front of you. From the outside, it looks like progress. From the inside, it can feel strangely hollow. The effort is still there, sometimes more than ever, but the feeling of why begins to fade. Tasks get completed, but they don't land. Days pass, but they don't feel distinct. Motion continues, yet it doesn't feel like it's leading anywhere. And this can be deeply confusing. Because you're doing the things you were told would matter, you're being productive, you're staying engaged with life. So when the sense of fulfillment doesn't follow, The mind doesn't know where to place that absence. It doesn't feel like failure, and it doesn't feel like loss. It feels more like a quiet disconnect, as if meaning itself has grown distant without ever fully leaving. Effort without resonance begins to weigh on you, not in an obvious way, but in the way repetition weighs on the body when it no longer feels purposeful. You move, but there's no internal pull. You respond, but nothing is being answered. And over time, this creates a fatigue that isn't physical or emotional. It's existential, because humans aren't worn down only by difficulty. They're worn down by effort that no longer feels connected to anything deeper. When actions stop reflecting inner values, when routines continue without inner alignment, when life becomes a series of obligations rather than expressions. This doesn't arrive suddenly, it emerges quietly, in the background of daily life, in the sense that you're maintaining momentum but not direction, in the feeling that you're present but not fully engaged. And because nothing is visibly broken, this kind of heaviness is easy to dismiss. You tell yourself to keep going, to stay focused, to push through. But the weight isn't coming from the effort itself. It comes from the absence of meaning beneath that effort, from carrying on without feeling internally met by what you're doing. And when meaning erodes, even gently, life doesn't stop. It just starts to feel heavier, not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're moving without the quiet sense that it matters in the way it once did. At this point, it becomes important to say something clearly, not as reassurance, but as recognition. There is nothing wrong with you. This heaviness is not a sign that you are failing at life or falling behind some invisible standard. It is not evidence that you are broken, weak, or unable to cope. In many cases, it's the opposite. Heaviness often appears first in people who are paying attention, people who notice patterns, people who register subtle changes in themselves and in the world around them. Awareness carries weight. When you are sensitive to shifts, in pace, in meaning, in emotional tone, you feel those shifts internally before they become obvious on the surface. What others move past without registering, you absorb. What goes unnamed still leaves an impression. This isn't dysfunction, it's responsiveness. The nervous system is designed to track more than immediate danger. It also tracks continuity, coherence, and strain over time. When things speed up without pause, when demands stack without resolution, when meaning thins out quietly, the body and mind register that. Not as panic, not as collapse, but as weight. And that response is logical. A system that notices accumulation will eventually feel burdened by it. A mind that stays aware will eventually register the cost of constant engagement. A person who reflects will feel the pressure of living in a world that rarely slows down long enough to be felt. So the heaviness you're carrying doesn't mean you're incapable of handling life. It means you are responding honestly to it. There is a kind of dignity in that, even if it hasn't felt that way. Because rather than numbing out, you're still present. Rather than disconnecting completely, you're still aware. Rather than ignoring the weight, you're noticing it. That noticing is not a flaw. It's an indication that your inner world is still intact, still sensing, still responding, still alive to what's happening beneath the surface. And when you begin to see heaviness this way, something subtle shifts. You stop treating it as an enemy. You stop reading it as a personal failure. And in its place, there's a quieter understanding. That feeling weighed down is sometimes the most human response there is, especially in a world that asks so much and pauses so rarely. Once heaviness is seen clearly, not judged, not rushed, not misunderstood, something begins to change, not in the feeling itself, but in the way it's held. Understanding doesn't make the weight disappear. It doesn't lift it off your shoulders or replace it with certainty, but it does soften the struggle against it. When a feeling no longer has to be explained away or argued with, it becomes less isolating. It stops feeling like a personal failure and starts to feel like part of being human, something that can be noticed without being resisted. And in that noticing, there is a subtle sense of space, not relief, not resolution, just space. Space to recognize that this heaviness didn't appear without reason, space to see that it has been shaped by awareness, effort, and endurance. Space to understand that it doesn't define you, it's something you're moving through. This is where longing quietly enters. Not the longing for change, not the longing for answers, but the longing for a different relationship with what you're carrying. A sense that life doesn't have to feel this dense forever. That weight can shift, not by force, but by understanding. That awareness itself can bring a gentler way of moving forward, even if nothing else changes yet. There's something grounding in realizing you're not alone in this experience, that others carry similar weight, often in silence, that this heaviness is shared, even when it feels deeply personal. And maybe the most important thing is this: you don't need to resolve this feeling tonight. You don't need to reach clarity or closure. It's enough to recognize it, to name it without judgment, to sit with the understanding that heaviness is not a verdict on your life, but a reflection of how deeply you've been living it. So if you find yourself in a quiet moment, especially when the world finally slows down, and that familiar weight returns, perhaps it doesn't need to be fixed. Perhaps it only needs to be understood, and perhaps, for now, that understanding is enough to make you feel a little less alone.